if our interpreters can hear us, we can start. Welcome, everyone. I am Sumru from the Speak Up platform, and I'm sure most of you know about our platform, but I still wanted to make an introduction. We operate under P24 independent journalism platform, working on censorship and other freedom of expression violations in the field of culture, arts, media, and we conduct activities such as monitoring, reporting, and advocacy. In fact, censorship mechanisms increase every year, and it is very important to defend freedom of artistic expression, which is what we're going to do in this panel. We're going to go into more depth on freedom of artistic expression. And I'd like to thank Banu, Ole, and Sarah for accepting to be the speakers on the panel. And Banu will also be moderating the panel. Now, to introduce our speakers, Banu Karaca works at the intersection of political anthropology and critical theory, art and aesthetics, nationalism and cultural policy, museum and feminist memory studies. She interrogates the freedom of expression in the arts, the visualization of gendered memories of war and political violence, visual literacy, and arts restitution. And she's also the founder of Siyah Band, a research platform that documents censorship in the arts in Turkey. Ole Raitov founded and directed Free Museum, has been working on freedom of artistic expression, has been the Free Muse representative to the UN Human Rights Council and been a member of the UNESCO Convention Expert Facility on Artistic Freedom. He's produced the World Conference on Music Censorship and has also looked at censorship in the arts in Turkey. And Sarah White has worked as director of PEN International's Freedom of Expression program and has campaigned also at the human rights at Amnesty International. And she's also working on projects among UNESCO, Free Muse and Culture Action Europe. Banu, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sumru, and good evening to everyone who's joining us from Turkey and elsewhere. It's lovely that you made the time to be with us, even though we cannot see most of you at the moment, unfortunately. Thank you to Susma and to Sumru and Sonai for organizing this session and for bringing me once again together with Sarah and Ole, from both of whom I've learned a lot, and I'm always benefiting from our exchanges. I'm very happy that we can do this together this evening. Before starting off, we sort of thought about a format where we start with three larger questions that map a little bit the terrain of artistic freedom within the larger field of freedom of expression. But before I get us started with these three questions, which at the end of which we'll check in with the audience and see if questions have arisen, and then we can maybe go to a bit more interactive format. And if people feel shy about sort of asking questions, then we'll sort of go another round after that. But I wanted to make a few introductory remarks, not to recapitulate what has happened in Turkey over the past few years, but which would be a difficult task and take up perhaps too much time. I wanted to just make a couple of introductory remarks, beginning with the title of this panel. I sort of started using this idea of the art and art censorship as the canary and the coal mine. When I found that there was very little awareness among, be it policymakers or even international human rights organizations, for why art should be of special concern in contrast to other areas. And this is also true for research. And my sense was that this image of the canary in the coal mine was quite helpful. And I want to recount one event that many of you might be familiar with, which was the censorship or the attempted ban, then also successful ban in the end, of Bakur during the 2015 Istanbul Film Festival. At the time, while the ongoing peace talks were fragile, they were still ongoing in Turkey. And there was a perspective for peace, again, however fragile it was. So the attempted ban through quite high up channels and quite visibly through intervention of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, through security forces in Istanbul itself, seemed to indicate a sea change much earlier than the actual end of the peace process and the resurgence of violence on part of the Turkish military on Kurdish cities that unfolded even more so after the 2015 elections. Especially over the past some 5 years, more than 5 years, it's hard to enumerate the transgressions against freedom of expression, but I would be remiss to not to mention that after the failed coup attempt in 2016, what we found when we put together the Universal Periodic Review, where with SUSMA and again with in collaborations through Free Muse and Article 19, what we found is that really this codification of the state of emergency that had lasted for 2 years into law had opened up the floodgates for much more, for much broader and easier infringements on artistic expression than we had previously seen them. And what we also noticed, which is something that we can perhaps sort of locate if we were to make a chronology from 2013 onwards, is that many of the kinds of restrictions that have been used against Kurdish artistic production and Kurdish artists became more and more commonplace throughout Turkey. We saw that this also with the curtailing of LGBTI plus cultural events and assembly, where similarly to Kurdish artistic production, LGBTI plus cultural production or assemblages were very easy to be labeled terrorist. We've seen this again more recently in feminist organizing, as well as with protesting students. The issue of what constitutes terrorism or how the charge of terrorism is used to delimit freedom of expression will certainly come up repeatedly, since this is not just an issue within Turkey, but as Agnes Kalama, the Special Rapporteur for Extrajudicial Killings of the UN, has stated now for many years, the global war on terror has become de facto international law, even though it's not codified by international law, which has allowed a lot of countries, just like Turkey, to use the charge of terrorism to delimit all kinds of expressions, including artistic expressions. At the same time, we've also been witnessing that the question of freedom of expression, or the debates on freedom of expression, have been adopted by the political right across Europe and in the US as well. So a topic that used to be very much one of progressive movements has become a very important tool in the toolbox of authoritarian states, but also of right-wing and nationalist movements. And this is certainly a topic we'll also touch upon, I hope, in the remainder of our time together. Still, and you know, I would also be remiss not to mention that, especially in the context of Europe, but not only there, higher education, institutions of higher education are also battling with issues around censorship and curtailed freedom of expression, or what freedom of expression might mean at a university or at institutions of higher education, where increasingly scholars who are doing anti-racist, anti-colonial, or anti-sexist work are often characterized as curtailing others' freedom of expression. Still, and I think this is the reason why Susma got us together, in these dark times, it's sometimes important to come back to the basics and to review some of the main concepts and tools and experiences in the struggle for artistic freedom. A concept that, by the way, as Sarah has reminded us in the preparation to this panel, is codified as a separate category constitutionally by 22 countries around the globe, Turkey being one of them. So perhaps we could then begin with the question, why is there, or was there, or is there still a necessity to have a separate category of freedom of the arts, of arts freedom, apart from general regulations that guarantee free expression? Sarah, perhaps we can start this round with you and then go over to Ole. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
This is the curse of the Zoom, isn't it? Thank you very much, Banu, for your kind comment there. And thank you, Susma, so much for allowing us, me, some time on with you on artistic freedom, a subject that has been very close to my heart for many years. Banu is right that there has been rather little awareness of the extent and what is artistic freedom. And she asked the question as to why is it important for us to protect this right. I think what I would like to do first is just to give you an idea of what the extent of artistic freedom is abused globally. As I mentioned, that there is very little awareness and rather limited monitoring of this. But there is one organization that has been doing this for a number of years, and that's Free Muse, and it issues an annual report every year. Now, I've given Sumu I think, did you get a PowerPoint just to show, if you bring that up, I'll give you an idea of the picture there. Waiting one moment, another Zoom curse. Thank you. It's a separate. Oh. This is another presentation. There's one which has a single. Okay, Sumru. It's another presentation. I think if you can just close it, I can do it verbally. The Free Muse report this year lists 978 instances of attacks on artistic freedom in that past year. And they list in 89 countries across all world regions. They rate Bangladesh and Belarus, the usual China, Cuba, Egypt, Turkey, Uganda, the US, and India. Now, most of these attacks are attacks on artworks themselves, that they're taken down or censored, but also many of these artists have been imprisoned, and the report refers to 82 who were imprisoned that year. Another 133 detained, that is, that they're waiting trial and prosecution. 17 were killed, 10 of which were in one band, in one group in Mexico. Here we go. Thank you. Here we have the pages. There we are. So where we have the figures, we have 133 are detained, 82 in prison, 17 killed, another 107 prosecuted. That means defined or other sentences brought against them. The other attacks range from being physically attacked, being constantly persecuted and harassed and threatened, having work destroyed or damaged, being banned from traveling, many sanctions and fines, and many, many acts of censorship. Now, this report gives you a fuller picture, and you can see the link below, but it gives you an idea of where the artistic freedom attacks are happening. But I also have to say that this isn't a completely full picture. There are other ways that artistic freedom is suppressed in much more subtle means. Well, I say subtle, but it's not so subtle for artists themselves. And that is through financial means, for instance, not being able to get grants, not being able to get, not being allowed to have a place to perform, not being given a space in an exhibition or in a theatre. So there are many other ways of censorship. So this picture itself isn't a complete one. And finally, because, as I mentioned earlier, there is not consistent monitoring of artistic freedom, because there aren't the organizations there that are doing it systematically. And because there isn't really a full understanding of awareness of what artistic freedom is, not only among artists, but also beyond, that we don't have a full picture of what the extent of the artistic freedom abuses are. So just to give you a sort of overall global picture that this is a problem that is very widespread.
Or do you want to make some remarks on this issue?
Yeah, I think that somehow censorship of the arts has taken place almost, since ancient times. There's always been this need to regulate. The thing about the arts is that it's moving us. It's so much part of our identity, either in terms of what we do not like, because I think most of us have a lot of kind of art we don't like. We reject bad music or bad films or bad whatever. And at the same time, many of us have this great enthusiasm for certain expressions. There's always been good or bad reasons for authorities or philosophers to ban or to regulate this. I mean, already good old Plato was talking about this, that there was the good art and the bad arts. And somehow this is where we still are. Nothing new has happened really in the past couple of 1,000 years in terms of regulations. Maybe it's a little bit more complex today because we live in a digital age, but the mechanisms are basically the same. Those in power want to regulate what people can hear and see. And then you have on the other side the artists who want to express themselves. And when it comes to Turkey, if I may jump to a conference I was very happy to do with my dear friend Şener Yurda-Tapan in 2006 on music censorship. I remember a session that Şener was organizing with Turkish composers and musicians. And maybe Şener can add to this later today. But there was one quote I remember from Bülent Forta, who is a producer and director of the Turkish phonographic industry. He said, Turkish history is a history of censorship. And it's very true, because when you look, for instance, at music, there's been all kinds of censorship since the start of the Republic for various reasons. We can come back to that. But I don't know if this is the time to sort of just say, what are we talking about when we talk about artistic freedom? Because if you could put back the PowerPoint, and we're not going to lecture anyone on PowerPoint for the next 30 minutes, but sometimes it's good to be reminded of what are we talking about. Many of you will know these things already, but if you could put the PowerPoint up, then we could start to talk about one definition of what artistic freedom is. We're still waiting for the PowerPoint. But you said that both Sarah and I are working within the and with UNESCO. We have been. You can go back a little bit. Yeah, next one, please. Right. So UNESCO has this definition, which relates to what is called the 2005 Convention on Diversity of Cultural Expression. And that is not a definition that is used by anyone. But let's say for this discussion, at least some of these issues would be what we are talking about. So obviously the right to create without censorship or intimidation, that's a very basic right. With UNESCO, artistic rights also include social and economic rights. I don't think we are going to talk a lot about this, but it's one of these issues that, at least in UNESCO context, is important. So otherwise, freedom of movement, freedom of association, and then these protection of social and economic rights, and not least the right to participate in cultural life, because that's frequently forgotten. That's not just a question of artists having the right to produce and distribute. It's also the right of the common people, for anyone, to take part in cultural life without restrictions. And of course, all these are being violated one way or the other. Some people might say, what, freedom of association, why is that important? Well, it's important because if artists are not sort of allowed to organize themselves, how can they defend themselves? And in many countries, this is not the case. You could take Egypt as an example. All the so-called artists' organizations are state-controlled. And in these organizations, you have artists who are actually the controllers. So you have artists controlling the artist, which is another issue that we could talk long about. So if I can have the next one, some of the key questions that we may talk about today are, and also have in mind, are sort of what are the official legal instruments that relates to this. We may talk about hate speech. We may also talk about which laws that are used to curtail these freedoms, several, and how is that impacting the situation in your own country. When it comes to the legal instruments, if I can have the next one, then the overall protection is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19. Next slide, please. That is something we should all remember. That goes, as an umbrella to everything. And again, it includes the rights to hold opinions without interference and seek, receive, impart information, ideas. And this thing about seek, is also very relevant to the whole discussion about the internet today. Then you have various specific international conventions, of which Turkey have ratified most of them, but don't implement. The next one is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. If you can have the next slide. Yeah. So this also is very clear about the right to take part in cultural life and to enjoy the benefits. Here it also mentions scientific progress. And of course, you also mentioned that, Banu, there are huge problems today in the academic world of freedom. And then it also mentions the moral and material interests, the remunerations, the authors' rights, and so on and so forth. Then we have another international convention, which is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Next one, please. And that's in Article 19. Is again talking about the right to freedom of expression. And then comes all the buts, because BOT is a big thing in international conventions. The next one is good to have in mind, because this is, I would say, the most abused part of the convention. It gives a right to restrict certain expressions. And it says respect of the right or reputations of others, protection of national security or public order or public health and morals. Now, this is like buying 10 meters of elastics and spread it out to 10 kilometers, because that's the way it's being used. And we've seen that in many courts. Because what does it mean? What does it mean to protect the morals or public health? That is really being abused. You could go on to the next one. So quickly run through. This deals with terrorism and artistic freedom, because what we see, and it's just sort of headlining now, is that many laws are applied to, you know, knee-jerk reaction or can become instruments of censorship. We'll definitely come back to that. And then quickly to the next one, what is typical of those who feel that they are being abused, next one please, is what we call the 3 R's, the rulers, religion, and royals. Now in this case, the president of Turkey may not be royal, but he's definitely making use, or his lawyers are making use of this insult and defamation idea. But it could even be applied to other issues such as business leaders, flags. Flags and symbols are very typical things that you could end up in court for. There are several others. I think we can stop here because we're not going to have a full lecture on all kinds of issues. But it just shows some of the issues that we're going to talk about today and how complex the thing. And the reason that we need to address artistic freedom specifically is because there are specific issues that are very specific to artists, as there are specific issues related to media and to academics as well. So therefore, we need gradually to document these things because it's all very complex. If we go down to genres, you know, it maybe at a later stage we could come back to the fantastic history of music censorship in Turkey, because it also somehow tells a different story of the country and how the country has developed and changed over time, whether it's a question of what is national identity, what is foreign influence, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, thank you to both of you, Sarah and Ole. I think, you know, what I've always find quite striking when it comes to both provisions that guarantee freedom of that are designed or are intended to guarantee freedom of the arts and its restriction is when you look at it from a perspective of state actors, is that there's both this understanding of the transformative potential of art, right? And the need to be able to curtail it when deemed necessary. And I think, thank you, Ole, also for mentioning that we often think of artistic freedom as a right of the producers, which is of course very important, but it's also important to keep in mind that access is likewise guaranteed by these provisions, so that people should be able to have access freely to all kinds of artistic production and cultural production. And I remember in times where we could still argue these kind of cases with local governors, this was always sort of the 2 prongs that we used. So it was not just the right of the producer, but also the right of the audience to have access to certain works. Yes, it's really striking to see that within the was it the UNESCO Convention, Ole, where exactly these national security, public order, public health is already delimited, the buts are already in there. And those are, is it was it
No, no,
UNESCO
it's
or no?
basically in the international covenant. So
Yes, sorry,
so
in the
the
internet.
Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, for instance, has this,
Yeah.
and it's a minefield. It's an absolute minefield.
Yeah.
Because who's deciding on this? And it's been happening, I would say, in almost any country of the world. It's not specific for one country. Most countries have gone through this process where, I mean, when I was young, it was a question of should rock and roll music be allowed or not in public radio? Was it destroying the moral? And of course it was. It was totally destroying the morals. You can see the result here. But they didn't succeed stopping it completely.
Yeah, but it's striking that those national security, public order, public health, and public morals is exactly the fault lines that, for instance, we sort of worked out in the last UPR one more time. I mean, not that has changed much, but it's exactly fits in exactly along those categories. Perhaps for the next round, we could talk a little bit from your working experience in the field, what your sense is of what kind of violations we find, or how you would characterize, if you had to group them ever so roughly, in terms of what the kinds of violations that you've encountered perhaps most frequently, and what kind of infringements you might want to share for the purpose of this particular conversation. Sarah, do you want to go first again? I see you.
Again, always happy first. Yes, well, we've just touched on the issue of terrorism. This has been a long-standing problem. I've been monitoring freedom of expression since the early 90s, and terrorism has always been one of the legislation, the reasons for arresting your problematic. And particularly in areas where there is minority rights and those sort of issues. And of course, it's an area that really took after 9/11 as well. And it began being adopted not only by the usual suspects, but also much more widely. Not always in terms of imprisonment, but in other ways of kind of discouraging you from doing certain kinds of work. And there is this issue of interpretation. What is insult? I may be insulted by one thing that you may not find at all insulting, for instance. There's always a choice of the court, there's always a choice of the government as to what isn't insulting, what is and isn't defamatory, what is and isn't against the morals, what is and isn't obscene. And it's always those decisions of those in power as to what happens. And those are things which shift all the time. And sometimes they might even shift within one government. The public opinion is something which has also been driving a lot of the decision, particularly in the last decade or so with social media, where you are getting governments with one eye on the discourse on social media to make the decisions. And as many of the voices on social media tend to be the extreme and the extreme right, that has been falling, has been also pushing the agenda of governments in that direction. So, so this has been a long-standing issue, terrorism and interpretation of what maybe on the surface seem like reasonable laws, particularly those maybe when you have got a real public emergency like today, where you might think, okay, there might be a good reason to curtail certain kinds of expression briefly in order to stop certain kinds of panic or otherwise. But then again, that's very much due to interpretation and manipulation by those in government. So it's very interesting when you see that what might look like a reasonable and benign clause in the universal, the ICCPR, I think it is, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it can be manipulated and overlooked by those who wish to keep their critics in silence.
Yeah, I'd like to add that it's also a question how we make use of words because, as Sarah said, the whole thing about terror has come up a lot after 9/11, but we could also look at it from the other perspective of states being terror states. Now, a few examples are, Indonesia was under terror for many years, killing millions of communists. Now, still in Indonesia today, you cannot address communism as an artist. It's simply not possible. So those films who have now, many, many years after, even been portraying and interviewing some of those who were killing on behalf of the state, that film cannot be shown in Indonesia. We could take the example of terror regimes like Stalin's Soviet Union or the Nazi Germany or even South Africa apartheid system. These were states who made use of terror mechanisms, but it's seldom being described at that. And it had huge effects on the arts and regulating every single of it. And again, these terror states would make use of words that are incredibly dangerous, which are similar to this about public, moral, and health. So frequently you hear arguments as, this is alien. This is alien. So the whole immigrant discussion we have in Europe and the States now, there are parts of that you can go back to Nazi Germany, who would say that jazz music is alien to our culture, gypsy music is alien to our culture. And then you narrow down the scope of normality. So we have really to be very careful when we talk about these things. And unfortunately, also in the international system, in the Human Rights Council, it's very seldom that states would make use of these words and actually address this and say, well, I'm sorry, sir, but you represent a terror state. It's not just IS that is a terror state. We have other terror states in this world, unfortunately. And state terrorism is unfortunately one of the main issues when it comes to curtailing freedom. Then the other thing is, of course, the whole issue of religion and those trends that we see along the lines of 9/11 and even before 9/11. I mean, if we go back to the revolution in Iran, then you could see how different versions of fundamentalist Islam has spread over the world, whether it's the Saudi Arabian version of Wahhabism, which is really widespreading these days, or it is the Iranian version. And it's completely parallel to how the Christian missionaries used to do it, how Christian missionaries were destroying whole cultures because they wanted to do good, because they had a better idea of how the world should look like. And so this combination of state terrorism, religious fundamentalisms, and sometimes commercialism hand in hand are really big enemies, which I think is reflected also in our neighboring sectors like the media or the academic world, because this combination can be really, really dangerous.
I want to come back just ever so briefly to one issue that, of course, is very important in Turkey, but not only in Turkey, and that's the sort of issue around insult. As Sarah and Ola, as you both have said, the delineation between insult and its counterpart, which is protected by most laws, especially like in the case of Turkey, critique. This used to be an argument that was much wider available, I think, for instance, in the 2000s in Turkey. Even probably up until the Gezi protests. But then we see how laws that could bring someone to trial, but not necessarily end in a conviction, then all of a sudden the sort of balance shifted, and they were both brought to court and ended up in either extraneous fines or even imprisonments. So what looks perhaps on paper like guaranteeing this difference between insult and critique, and also the regulation that people in power or who have an official office should be able to should be criticizable in a way that perhaps a private person, a person who's not in public office, ought not to have to bear, so to speak. That has completely, not completely, but largely shifted to a very restrictive kind of interpretation. And this is, of course, we can see this year by year in how the numbers of these cases have grown I don't want to talk about exponential growth since we're in a pandemic, but they have grown exponentially throughout especially the past 10 years or so, very visibly. I'm not sure if this is also the case to the same extent in other places around the world. Maybe we could pick up around the third complex of issues that we wanted to raise in this initial sort of, or in this introductory part, which pertains to the legal tools we have potentially available to us to deal with these infringements on artistic freedom. Ole, do you want to perhaps?
Yeah, it depends
continue?
really on where we are situated in the world. But I mean, there is the principal thing, and then there is reality. But if we take it from most countries we know of, you normally would start in the lower courts. I mean, you will be put in court, and of course, in principle, the court system should be independent of the state. This is not the case in Turkey. Everyone knows that. It's not the case in Poland and Hungary and in many other countries. But in principle, that's the way it should be. The court should be independent, and you can go to court, you can continue to Supreme Court. And in the European context, which includes Russia and Turkey, you can then take your case to the European Court. And there's been quite a number of cases, including on artistic freedom in the European Court. Mostly it's Russia and Turkey, and mostly they lose the cases. And they are supposed to pay compensation or, you know, release people. But then, as we know, they just continue making new cases. Then there are a number of complaint mechanisms within the UN system. You can make complaints to so-called UN special rapporteurs, and they don't have any legal right to do anything, but they can send communications to the country. They can address issues. But you also have, within UNESCO, there's a complaints mechanism, which is half secret, I would say. You know, Sarah and I definitely tried to get UNESCO to put it much more forward, but you can make individual complaints, and those complaints are then being discussed behind closed doors, completely closed doors. There will be representatives from countries from all corners of the world. So in the same room, you could have, you know, countries like Saudi Arabia, Sweden, Brazil, South Africa. And they will then look into the complaints and discuss with the particular country. And I only have one experience from that, was cases in Iran, which in the end led to Iran releasing 2 artists, but these 2 artists are still in Iran. They can still not perform. They're still banned from that. And then you have something called the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, which is a rather complicated mechanism where you need to have all your papers in order. I have one experience. I know Sarah has, from Penn, more experiences of that mechanism. I don't know, Sarah, if you want to fill in on the UN Working Group there.
Yeah, but one thing I'd really like to say is that all of these working groups, all of these international mechanisms, whether it's in the UN or UNESCO, are highly reliant on getting information from us, from civil society, from artists, from the victims themselves, from human rights defenders. There's sometimes an assumption there are big machines, that they have a lot of staff and a lot of resources. That's not the case. The special rapporteurs, for instance, might just have one, sometimes part-time staff member. So it's very important, if you want to use these mechanisms, that you do actually approach them with information, with complaints. And it's all available on their websites. You can make submissions to these organizations. The UNESCO also has a mechanism that civil society can feed into, aside from, as Ole explained, a rather difficult to access complaints mechanism. But every 4 years, every state that has signed on to the 2005 Convention, which also includes Turkey, by the way, has to report on how it's acceding to that. One of the criteria that the states have to report on is artistic freedom. What they are asked to do is also to make their own analysis of how they're doing, but also asked to consult with civil society organizations. In this case, it will be arts and cultural organizations, on how they are progressing. The problem is that the invitations come from the states. So the states themselves are going to select who they would like to hear. They're not supposed to do that. They're supposed to open it to everybody. So I would also argue that you should try, as a civil, any organizations or individuals here, to try and access that mechanism and to contribute to it. Just going back a little as to why maybe these organizations aren't fully informed about artistic freedom, is that some of the civil society organizations themselves are reluctant to report to those states, simply because they fear for whatever repercussion that there might be. But these are big machines, big mechanisms. They take a very long time. They're absolutely essential. We should be working with them. But on the other hand, I think we also need to be looking also at what we're doing at home and nationally to get the concept and the idea and the importance of artistic freedom known by the public, by the people on the ground, who can then work it up towards the big international mechanisms and then put a kind of 2, 3, 4 pronged pressure on a government from very different sides.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, because one of the things that I've always found strikingly wrong, and there are many reasons to that, is that the artists' organizations are seldom the organizations that document violations. They're seldom the organizations that support artists, unlike journalists. I mean, journalists all over the world somehow, and I know it sounds like a cliche, we've used it before, but somehow it's in your DNA as a journalist to protect freedom of expression. That doesn't mean that all journalists do that, because, I mean, there are as many journalists that are violating others' right to freedom of expression and are simply his master's voices. But at least you have journalist organizations in most parts of the world which document these violations, which is also why I, like Sarah, is skeptical to a lot of statistics, because especially with artistic freedom, we simply don't know enough. But with media, we know much more. So when Turkey is now number 156 in Reporters Without Borders annual statistics, that says a lot, and that's well documented. So could we make a parallel to artistic freedom and say Turkey would also be 156 there? I don't know, but I think there's a relationship to how media is being repressed and how artists are being repressed. It's just that the mechanisms are very, very different. But of course, journalists also face self-censorship as well as artists do. Journalists are dependent on media conglomerates. A lot of artists can of course make use of the internet today. It's just that they don't get paid for that, so it doesn't help them a lot. They often need a company. And I think the reference to media conglomerates and the way it's being controlled, for instance, in Turkey, it's very well established that many of the media organizations are also in other kinds of businesses, whereas they also get more dependent on the state as a funder to other projects, whether it's in construction or wherever it is. So that in itself is also very, very dangerous for the diversity. And of course, when any production company in the arts have some kind of connection or are semi-dependent on the state, that is where they also start self-censoring. And it creeps into everyone, maybe I shouldn't do this. And the strange thing, I'm sitting here in Copenhagen tonight, Sarah's sitting in London. And in principle, we have all the rights to freedom of expression in our countries. But do people make use of it? No, they don't. They make use of it of slander, intimidation, or whatever on social media. But when it comes to standing up and really addressing very big issues, I think there's a tendency that a lot of people simply shut up, except from, as you mentioned, Banu, the right-wingers. The right-wingers are putting forward their positions these days, talking about them being the defenders of freedom of expression.
Yeah, this is something that's been sort of, one of the, not the only thing, but it's been something that's been keeping me up at night, where I sort of often think, when did we lose the plot so badly that this has been, such a rallying call for the political right, whereas the left seems to have completely dropped the ball on it. There was a question in the chat that I was only made aware of a bit later. We've started answering that by Alex Lefebvre. What is the international recourse to judge states on artistic censorship? Ole, you have mentioned the convictions at the European Court of Human Rights, and also mentioned how one can go through sort of first national, but the question was international. Other than the European Court of Human Rights and the kind of mediating mechanisms that you've talked about, which are much more closed door and harder to access, I'm wondering, is there anything we've left out so far in terms of international recourse?
No, I think you already mentioned the UPR, and for those who are not aware of the UPR, it's a Universal Periodic Review. In principle, you could say this is the examination of any UN member country human rights records, and that is being done every 4.5 years. And frequently what happens is that you will have a group of other countries examining, if it's Turkey, they will be examining, they will come up with a lot of recommendations, and they have come up with a lot of recommendations, and Turkey has accepted many of these recommendations. And actually most countries get a lot of recommendations. The country I live in, Denmark, got a lot of recommendations which were fair criticism. And it's, in that sense, it's an interesting process, because you may have Turkey criticizing Denmark, you will have Denmark criticizing Iran, and Iran criticizing France, or whatever. So everyone can criticize each other. The difference is, of course, what happens after 4 years. Have the recommendations been put in place? And seldom it's lip servicing, except for those countries who take human rights very seriously. And that, of course, also creates some kind of imbalance, because on one level, many of the countries here in the north are very strong defenders of human rights and freedom of expression, but it doesn't mean they're always very good at tackling. When we get them in our backyard, we saw that with the Khartoum crisis, and we see it increasingly with civil society pressure on arts institutions, and so forth. There's a tendency to sort of, it's not a big problem here. And anyway, we stand for freedom of expression. Without limitations. And there's one more complexity, which is that national legislations are not the same. So, I mean, you have countries in Europe where you're not allowed to neglect Holocaust. I mean, we can all say this is fair, but there are these limitations, which means that in principle, if you do that, you can be convicted.
I'd just like to put in a word about the rapporteur in the field of culture, Karima Benoon, who published a report earlier last year where she underlined that cultural rights defenders should have the same status as human rights defenders, that artists and cultural workers aren't really given the recognition that they deserve, and that it's not taken with the same weight, maybe, as with other forms of human rights. And that's a really interesting argument. It's the first time that it's only heard such an argument being made. Now, not all artists want to be seen as human rights defenders, it has to be said, but it's important that the international human rights community does see them as such. So we are also seeing in the last, I suppose, 4 or 5 years, whereas maybe prior to that, I had some difficulty in getting my human rights defender colleagues to recognize artists as legitimate cases. But in recent years, I'm finding that increasingly they are taking up supporting and understanding. So you will see organizations like Frontline Defenders will have artists on their list, specifically mentioned as artists as well. I think there's something moving there. So I believe the question referred to the International Commission of Jurists. To my knowledge, I don't think they've taken up artistic freedom cases. I might be wrong, but I wouldn't be surprised if over the coming years that we will find that they will be doing that naturally. And this is something to do with this kind of slow movement of better understanding and greater support as well. So, yeah.
There is also a tricky thing here, and I don't think we should get into the difficulty of defining what is an artist. But I mean, in principle, anyone can say, well, you know, what I said was an artistic expression. And then you may have sort of, okay, does it mean that because I sing that kill this guy, then it's an arts expression? So we also need to have a discussion that is, you know, dealing with these very, very difficult issues. There was a recent case in Sweden with a rapper who talked about a specific police woman that she should be sliced up. And that, I think, in many countries would have led to imprisonment immediately. But the High Court decided that that freedom of expression was more important, and one could not, I mean, if we compare to Turkey, where the judges don't seem to have any humor at all, they don't seem to understand a joke. I mean, you need to explain it to the judges frequently that this was a joke, but they don't see it as a joke. And the same thing goes with cartoons and so on and so forth. It's a very tricky area as such. And there was a general comment, as it's called, in the Human Rights Committee in 2011, which said that all public figures, including those exercising the highest political authority, such as heads of state and government, are legitimately subject to criticism and political opposition. I mean, it seems obvious for us that you have the right to criticize those, but unfortunately, the situation this was in 2011, it could also be today, that you had to point out the state of heads are not above the law. You can criticize them. But of course, when we look at the real situation, that is where many artists are now being put in front of courts.
I want to just, before I go to the next question that came through the chat, I want to just pick up one thing that came through in both of your interventions, Sarah and Ole, which is also the question not just of documenting the cases through civil society organizations, but especially artists organizations. And that's, of course, I mean, this is something we've wondered about again and again. And within the context of Turkey, there's been efforts at establishing alternative forms of organizing forms to the already existing ones, which are sometimes very hierarchical, top down, and not very very interested in doing this kind of rights work in the same way. But especially among contemporary visual artists, this has also been a long discussion. The actors and sort of theater association has now is unionized, whereas artists who are in the visual arts have a much harder issue or having difficulties getting organized in the same way. But this kind of organizing it seemed to me that you reminded also that this kind of organizing is vital if one is to pursue rights battles. There are, as you mentioned, also individual ways of sort of fighting for your right, which are rather long-winded and ultimately it seems to me we're always thrown back to this issue that it's not really done just by sort of this individual legal route, but it's really in that the power really lies in the organizing and mobilizing and in the alliances that can be made within the art world itself.
Can I ask a question? And if you're you more than anyone have been documenting violations, and you've been imprisoned as a composer. Why do you think it is that artists and artist organizations are not documenting and monitoring violations?
Yes,
are you there,
I'm here.
Sarah?
Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Can you
Why
see
is
me
it?
as well?
Unfortunately, we cannot see your
Why
beautiful
not?
face.
Like,
Okay. Excuse me, why not?
I don't know, maybe your camera is not on.
Of course it's not. It's open and I'm just waiting for that.
Okay, but go on. Why is it that I mean, you have like 30, 40 years experience of this, and you've been doing it, but why not your colleagues?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer. I don't know why they do not. We've been trying it for many, many years.
Yeah, but if I can say something about this, Ola,
Yeah,
I mean, I think there's two parts to it, because I mean, Susma has experience, of course, documenting now widely across the disciplines and also together with journalism. But from our experience at Siachband, what we found is that it takes an enormous amount of labor, which is not in itself the problem, but you know, when we were in parts, sometimes we're just 3 people who have full-time jobs otherwise. And we found that much of the sort of good research that we were to do early on, when we sort of got little bits and pieces and grants that would allow us to really dig in, you know, and really follow the strands as to how a censorship case actually occurred. You know, sometimes it's very easy to say, you know, if you get slapped with a case, that's very easy. But sometimes, you know, I'm thinking, it's a well-documented example by now, but when I'm thinking of the, before I give it over to Shana, when I think of an example like in 2005, I know this is from the past, we could, but still, let's stick with it, from one of the parallel programs to the biennial, where there was a lot of pressure made on the exhibition Free Kick. And where one of the artists, years later, Burak Delia, talked about how his artist colleagues actually, among all the other things that were happening, the catalog was confiscated on an anonymous complaint that it was, you know, insulting the military, for instance, and at some point the curator was put on trial, Halil Altsandere. But, you know, there's also other things that happen, like when Burak Delia talked about how his colleagues, his artist colleagues, kept telling him that he should really take down that one work. Because not for them, not because of them, but for his own protection. And where he was at the end so exhausted by it that he said, just go ahead, do it. And it was his artist colleagues who took it down. Or we have other examples of exhibitions where the police comes to investigate, which is in itself not a censoring act as such, but where then the curator decides to take pictures down that might be problematic. Of course, this is already censorship, but it's not, you know, you have to really look at these different levels and see who the actors are and how people really act in an individual case, which is why we sort of, whenever we can and could, try to do this very extensive kind of research where we try to, not everyone would talk to us, but we always try to get in touch with all the actors within a censorship case, you know. But I think Shanar was made co-host and now we can see him. So Shanar, please, the floor is yours. You have to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself. Shanar? Yep.
Put on the mic, yeah.
Okay.
No.
Is it all right now?
No.
I'd like to hear the translation. Is it okay? Can everybody hear it? Good. Okay. Good. Let me keep on. It has been the 26th year that we've been trying to active in this field. Well, the simple answer to your question about the artists first. Please, let's keep in mind that our memory includes Nazım Hikmet, what happened to him, and what happened to many other artists who tried to raise their voices, many killed, mostly imprisoned. So there has been a fear. That's why usually the idea of working on only my art was very popular. And after 60s and especially beginning of 70s, it was something different because then the workers' movements were increasing. And many artists were influenced and tried to give some, try to give some works on that field. But after 1971 and especially 1980 military regimes, they were still oppressed. Now, just a brief look at the picture of Turkey today on this issue. In 4 sentences, I can say that. First, in Turkey, any sort of political critics against President Erdogan, only artistic, are defined as a crime and oppressed. 2, musicians, especially Kurdish ones, and who support Kurdish people, you know Fatunç very well, actors, painters, cartoonists, whoever wants to raise their voices against the one-man regime, they meet the police, prosecutors, and judges. 3, speaking on artistic freedom, unfortunately, artists are still unorganized. From time to time, some protests arise in some points, but cannot turn to be an organized resistance. Such an attempt came from musicians with a declaration to support Bosphorus University students and teachers who face police brutality just because they oppose the new rector appointed by Erdogan directly. But it also seems to be forgotten soon as an exception. This is a simple picture now. I have some more things to say, but not at the moment. If you allow me, at the end, I like to make something practical, give you about an example about an attempt we're doing. Probably you can also help us to spread it all around the world. That's all for now.
Thank you. And it also reminded me, I mean, one of the aspects we've been talking about is also the institutions, of course, because when you remove heads of, you know, academic institutions dealing with the arts, and we've seen that particularly in Hungary, then you have a completely different way of saying, well, the artists should serve the country and this and this and that. And so with that, the students who may address different issues would not even go there. So on one level, and it's an interest, because this is also where we have in parallel world to the academic world, and why it's important to address the issues of academic freedom, is that on one level, you have the situation where the state removes people from state operas or theaters or whatever. Then you have the other movement at the moment, the whole identity politics, where, you know, it's more the students setting the agenda in the institutions, and where some of the, let's say, the old professors are now afraid to speak up in fear of losing their jobs. Interesting landscape, which actually present new challenges to artistic freedom and freedom of expression within the artistic field.
Perhaps, Sarah, please go ahead, and then I don't want to I want to make sure that we ask 2 more questions that have arisen. Please go ahead.
Oh, just very quickly, going back to your comment about the difficulties of setting up and working on Arts Freedom Monitor, and you're right, it's a lot of work, and you can't really expect just people who are trying to get on with their own lives and careers, particularly in such a precarious environment as in the arts, and also particularly in countries where there is the pressure, the threats of some kind of repercussions. So it's a matter of resources and also expertise. When I speak to other organizations wanting to take up art freedom work, that is their main block, just having sort of resources to be able to do the work. And on the other side, the funding bodies that tend to fund these organizations often have their own restrictions on who they can fund. So they will need to have the confidence, for instance, of knowing that that organization is a legal entity in that country, or can do the kind of reporting, financial reporting and other kind of due diligence, which of course is important. But in certain circumstances, in the kind of countries which are on that kind of particular pressure, that is just not possible. So it's kind of difficult, you know, it's kind of disappointing sometimes that the resources where they're most needed aren't actually going there. And you also mentioned briefly the lack of solidarity from other artists. That's something else that I've heard as well. Not necessarily lack of solidarity, yes, there is a bit of that as well, but also the kind of self-censorship is more and broader than just self-censorship. It's almost community self-censorship. People, they're not just advising you to not do that kind of work or not to prevent it, but they're also creating their own bigger bubble, their own bigger environment. So, yes, I can talk a little bit more about the role of associations in deciding who doesn't get, who can be seen as an artist and is therefore can access social welfare, but that's another thing we can talk about if we have time.
And there is just a small addition to what Sarah said, because the tendency we see in many countries is also now that if a CSO would like to monitor or document violations, they're termed as a foreign agent. And that in itself makes it very difficult to receive foreign funding. And increasingly, it closes a lot of activities, or they have to move to other countries. So that in itself is very problematic.
Yeah, I should just say, because not everyone might be in that lingo, civil society organizations here, so is what we're talking about. So there were two questions. Let me, although they're quite different, I want to mention them both and then sort of ask Sarah and Ole what you think, what you might, and I might also chime in, forgive me for that. But one was about funding and the sources of funding for the arts, and in what way these are also delimiting or censoring mechanisms, depending if this is public funding or public-private kind of mixed types of funding, or solely private funding. How you see the impact there on freedom of expression, or the limitations on freedom of expression in the arts. That was one question. The other question from quite a different field goes back to something that Ole has mentioned, this idea of alien to our culture, sort of make something, perhaps censor it, or at least often this is these are the kinds of expressions that happen before a work is censored, to make it vulnerable to censorship. This idea of this is alien to our culture. The person is wondering, I was wondering about your further ideas regarding this attitude of alienation. Do you think alienation occurs before censoring acts, or is alienation already censorship? Can talk about that. I have a few things to say about private funding, public funding, but perhaps one of you wants to start first. Sarah, if you want to go ahead, please unmute yourself.
I have to say I'm not a great expert on private and public funding, but I often explain to people who say, well, there are fewer cases of artists at risk. And I have to say that for many artists, you just have to go through so many extra hoops, and before you could even get your work onto the stage for it to therefore be banned, you know. And part of that is, let's say you're working with a theatre and they might love your work, but they can't risk their own funding, because a theatre that's likely to put on this kind of interesting, controversial work is quite likely to be reliant on state funding or on sponsorship. So they're not going to want to put it forward. So it's the same with anywhere where you require a public space in order to present your work. And you know, also by putting it there, you also subject it to the possibility of attack by extremists. And the theatre itself might not wish to put on a piece of work again. They may love it, but they may be worried about the safety of an audience, or the safety of their front of house staff and others as well. So there's a whole complexity of funding that goes behind the work before it can even get to the stage of being censored, shall we say? Or yeah.
There are several layers here. I mean, from my own experience, when I stopped working with free music in 2017, but in 2013, we had just done the first World Conference on Artistic Freedom in Oslo. It was the first time that artists from all over the world came and talked about repression and censorship. We had been involved in the first UN report by Farida Shahid on artistic freedom. We were actually incredibly successful in addressing artistic freedom in 2012 and 13. What happened was, in 2013, our main funder, the Swedish International Development Agency, said, we're not going to fund you anymore. I was sort of, what? They had been funding for 12 years. And it was not a question of the work. It was simply a question of, we're not going to operate small projects anymore. It's too expensive administrative to run small projects. So we were so close to close down the whole operation and everything we had done for the past 14 years. So we continued with 2.5 people for a year and a half before there was a new policy that they could make exceptions. And that's a problem for civil society organizations which are fully dependent on funding, whether it's government or semi-government or whatever. So I'm not afraid very much in this part of the world where I live of the arm's length principle. In general, the arm's length principle is good, but administrative procedures or focuses change. And there's a tendency that many organizations follow the money. So if there's a call for, now we want to know more about gender, then people run for gender. When it's LGBTI plus, then they run for that. So it's really a question of keeping, your direction and not run for where the money is. But many organizations do that, which also creates a lot of problems internally with human rights organizations, that suddenly this section becomes much bigger, or suddenly they need to spend much more money in 2 years. And that's really sad. But of course, there are many examples of donors who really closely say, we want you to do this. And then you have to stick up to that. So, I mean, I always wished I was a billionaire, so I could just do whatever I wanted and get a lot of people to work on these issues, but that's not the case.
But you have, Oliver, if I may just interject before I pass on that alienation question to you. I think you sort of talked about both sides of the spectrum, right? Sort of the funding for the arts itself, as well as funding for research on censorship in the arts.
No, it's the same.
And it's very much connected. And I think, my experience from working comparatively between the contexts of Germany and Turkey is that in Germany, where there's this idea that arts and everything is free, censorship and delimitations of artistic freedom work themselves much more behind closed doors. So non-funding, for instance, becomes a much bigger issue than in Turkey, where a lot of people are already sort of doing the budgets on their with great ingenuity, put them together, and make it sort of work, or produce works out of their own pocket. So, and when I was doing research on this, what I was always told is, oh, well, we don't, no one in the sort of governmental agencies decides, but we appoint a jury. But of course, how this jury or this committee is appointed is not subject to public knowledge at all. And it's not, this sort of bourgeois idea that sort of the best and the brightest sit on these committees that are not biased, is of course also something that we've long criticized. But I think non-funding in a lot of sort of countries in the European context is really the point. And I always say, censorship in Turkey is much more visible because it happens after the release. Not most of the time it doesn't happen, other than in cinema, which has a much more clearer sector. It has its own industry, so to speak, and a different kind of capital standing behind it. But generally in Turkey, censorship happens post-release, not at the genesis of an exhibition or a theater play or something.
But it's also related in that sense when we talk about alienation and whatnot, because exactly as you say, you simply don't fund certain things that the masters would not like, and part of that is of course alienation or national identity. I think there was this one, was it Goering, who said, when I hear the word culture, I put my hand on the revolver. I'm not sure it was Goering, but anyway, that is something that is happening all the time in this country where I live. National identity is one of the things that has been discussed over, since I was a child. And I always felt, your national identity is not my national identity. I didn't grow up with, all kind of folk music or whatever from my country. I grew up with Radio Luxembourg and rock and roll. which was definitely not Danish. And I mean, most of us today live in this mixed world of certain things we get from the country we grow up with. Marriages are mixed, you know, all kind of things are happening. So who is it that always are projecting this thing about national identity and the other thing about, no, that's alien to our culture? And again, Turkey is a very interesting example of this. I mean, Shana could talk for hours about how music have been moving, including, we had a pre-talk today about Eurovision Song Contest. And I know that one of Shana's songs was in the middle of that. We're not going to talk about that now, but if you look at Eurovision Song Contest, you can see how it is being used and abused by many countries to portray their so-called national identity, and that changes over time. So at one particular time, it can be very folkloristic. And the whole thing about folklore is that it's an invention itself. It's not folk. It's something that has been addressed by people who put it up on a stage and so on and so forth. So what we frequently see as folklore has nothing to do with the real thing anyway. But that's a different topic.
Shanarbe has raised his hand, and I'm going to give you the floor to you in a second. I just wanted to come back to this question. You know, this how can you say it? It's the pattern or the idiom of delegitimizing something as, you know, because it is supposedly alien. I think has also many interesting incarnations. I think, Ole, as you rightly say, wherever it flares up, questions around national identity and nationalism flare up, as it's been, for instance, in Poland, also in Hungary recently, where the questions have been raising from how much is the Holocaust our history, or how much is gender studies a part of Hungarian culture? You know, can it be a part of sort of Hungarian national culture or whatever?
I mean, there was this period in Turkey where all Egyptian films and music were banned. And what happened was that people did not tune into TRT, they tuned into Radio Cairo.
Exactly. At that point, I mean, that's why the ban wasn't upheld for a long time. I think a whole 6 months, because you couldn't get people to pry it away from them. But I do think, I mean, this question is very interesting. Is this designation as something to be alien already the act of censorship? It is certainly a legitimization sort of mechanism that works up to be censored, for sure, I think.
And the trouble with that is that it even goes down to small details. It can even be a particular sound. It may not be music itself, but certain sound or certain colors, you know, certain things that those crazy minds, censorship boards or whatever, interpret as something that is unnational, alien, you know, we shouldn't have it, stop it.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is that it somehow works, right? These kind of delegitimizing mechanisms. I have another example that's not from the realm of art with that, in which this has politically worked very well, but maybe Shanarbe, maybe we can, if you unmute yourself, you had your hand up.
Well, I was prepared to give you the answers about accessing funding and state politics, censorship and self-censorship, but I give up all because we came to another point. Not all. Censorship seems to be a problem, but self-censorship is a worse point, because you may not censor something, allow it to be heard or said, etc. But then you sentence them so hard that the people will have to censor themselves. Self-censorship comes, it is worse because it has no limits. The fear itself, it has no limits. Now, coming to Turkey now, it's a very well-known word in Turkey, yerli ve milli. means local and national. Well, it's even used by the legal authorities as this is not yerli milli. Whatever, what does it mean? Yerli milli, local and national human rights. Human rights is international, and according to Turkish legislation, it's also international. But they can put those frames into indictments too. So this affects, of course, all artistic works too. I want to stop here again, but please keep my word at the end. I want to give something else.
Yes, I have it on my list. I think the issue of self-censorship is something that is one of the topics, for instance, that Sumru in our preparation meetings also brought up. And, you know, that is, of course, for those of us who've worked on reporting censorship, it's the area that's the hardest to report, because I mean, sometimes I think, especially in retrospect, if some time has passed, artists are more willing or able to speak, as we all are, I think, about what moments where we sort of recognize that action of self-censorship. But in general, it's very, very hard to address. It's even harder to measure. How have you been dealing with it in your work, Sarah and Ola?
As you say, it is immeasurable. It's very hard to know what one act of, say, the imprisonment of one artist, what impact that had on stopping others from producing that kind of work. There was in the UK a couple of years ago a questionnaire sent out to artists about the levels of whether they had had their freedom of artistic expression curtailed. And most of them, I mean, obviously there hadn't been that many cases in the UK, but many of them replied that it was the pressure from their peers that stopped them from expressing their views. And this is, of course, this was actually about the time of the Brexit debate. So everything felt very, very hot, you know. So I think a lot of self-censorship is also, even in countries such as the UK, no, we're not perfect and there are certain issues that one thinks twice about. But there's all looking at each other, and you mentioned this a bit about the so-called cancel culture, whatever you want to call that. It's really, really difficult. I don't really know, but I would say that one person being arrested and detained would have a greater ripple effect, but the measurement of it, I really don't know.
It's a topic that has been on my interest list for many years, and I've spoken with quite a number of artists about it, and very few artists are willing to talk about it openly. But I'll mention one artist which I have high respect for, which is Didi Abadi from Senegal. He's a well-known rapper and producer and whatnot, and he was also good at articulating how you self-censor yourself differently over time, depending on the changes in society. So first time I talked with him about this was probably 20 years ago or something. He said that he could not, in his rap music, address religion. He couldn't question religion. He couldn't talk about homosexuality, and he couldn't talk about wife beating. But last time I spoke to him, which is quite a number of years ago, probably 5, 6 years ago, he said that has changed. I can still not talk about religion. In fact, that's been worse. I cannot talk about sexuality, homosexuality, but I can talk about wife beating. So that has been a change. And there is this sort of parallel world between the artists and the censors, because the other part of it is the censors, and it's difficult to get the censors forward. But we've been working with censors in Nigeria, in Kano State, and in Egypt Film Center. And sometimes these people come from the art field. And their argument is that, you know, it's better that I work as a censor because I understand the arts. And sometimes it's true. Definitely, if I go back to the Second World War in Denmark, there was a very well-known censor, and the cabarets in those days were basically the platform for criticism towards Germany and the Nazis. So he would read all the lyrics, and he would come back to the composers and the authors and say, look, you know, you cannot say this because the Germans will immediately understand it. But if you say it this way, the Danes are going to understand it, but the Germans are not going to understand it. So this sort of constructive collaboration between censors and artists is quite fascinating. And again, if we look at apartheid system over time, the censors were very much aware of the political changes. So for instance, when Mandela was released, immediately some songs that were mentioning Madiba were also released for broadcasting. So there can be very sensitive things, but it's a tough line. I wish more artists would come forward, also in regards to what do I do if I want to express certain things, but I get most of the money from commercial companies? Because commercial companies, as we know, especially in the visual arts field, are very dominant. And another field which we frequently forget is that many festivals, especially in Africa, but also in Asia, are funded by alcohol and tobacco companies. And you obviously don't criticize tobacco or alcohol companies in that context. So it's another way of, you know, where can I get the money? So what do I not talk about?
Yeah, I think this is a lot of food for thought. I remember a discussion I had with Sonai about self-censorship too, when she was doing her research, and exactly how we go about, how can we go about, what kind of questions should we even ask, you know, because these kind of decisions are quite harrowing, I think, for individual artists as well. I don't know, Sonai, if you had from your experience something perhaps to share with us in that regard, what your sense was doing research on that.
Actually, I was also thinking about our conversation and our dialogue about it. Yeah, actually, I think I cannot pinpoint some of the cases, but during my research where I was basically researching about the censorship cases in film in Turkey, in Turkish cinema, or cinema in Turkey after the 2000s, there are many instances that either people would say, I actually did self-censor in this movie or during this screening or something, or they can sometimes blame each other, or as you said, in retrospect, they can say, oh, actually, this happened because of this or that, but it's just like, usually either they are, in retrospect, talking about what they have done or what others have done, and they're criticizing their moves or such, and they're saying, or like basically, this person has done that because she or he was afraid of getting his or her funding cut off. So it's really interesting to see all these webs of coalitions, or like the webs of like all these interactions between artists, between state institutions, between corporations. yeah, it's just, yeah. I mean,
Yeah, and I think so, you know, this whole thing that it's often self-censorship is often sort of verbalized through the example of third persons, right? So those who are not there. It's very hard to talk about it as an individual experience. There is a question in the Q&A that I sort of have trepidations about asking, because I mean, it's one thing to have opinions, but it's another thing to be sort of a specialist in something. And that's the question about the role of non-state actors censoring on the grounds of community standards in corporate platforms like Facebook, TikTok, etc. The growing shifting roles as the digital corporates are increasingly aggressive in their proactive nature of enforcing content moderation, while using, of course, I'm saying, but unfortunately, algorithms, you know, which are themselves, I think this has been proven over and over again, that these algorithms also are not objective by any account, but just as biased as the people who code them, who produce them. I don't know, Ole, Sarah, I don't want to lean, I think they're specialists on this. I've been reading a lot about digital surveillance and digital sort of censorship, but is something from your work practice that stands out or that you would like to share or contribute in this regard?
Yeah, digital censorship of all sorts is really, really complicated. It really is problematic. It's particularly problematic for artists who are relying on platforms such as TikTok and Instagram in particular, and have their works taken down by these algorithms, have to fight to get them back, sometimes don't get them back. They lose their audience, their followers, have to rebuild them from scratch. So very often it's more damaging, shall we say, for this to happen to you as an artist, maybe I'm sure it's arguable, than, let's say, a person who is just, you know, putting out the occasional sort of ranting tweets that then get cut down. It's really a widespread problem, but I think it has a particular impact on artists being able to function at all, to get a platform and for income. So I'm not sure if that's the right answer to that, but it's certainly one that's been troubling me.
I think what's happening also is the other side of the coin, that a lot of artists are being threatened through social media by civil society operators. And that creates a lot of fear, and a lot of artists are not connecting. And same goes with scholars. A friend of mine who's a scholar on Iran just posted 2 days ago, what I'm going to do with all these hate mails that I receive. And it's the same for the artists. Most of them feel alone. They don't know where to go to. And in that sense, you could also argue that there needs to be some kind of moderation, or a publisher's responsibility. Because the strange thing is that for printed media, this is very regulated. The publisher has a responsibility. You could take the publisher to the court. But the internet is completely non-regulated. And I must say, in that sense, you need to find ways of regulating things. If people feel that they are, they want to make hate speech to anything, I think actually the publisher has the right to just close it down, skip it, delete it, block it, and even go to the police. I think, in fact, it's one of the difficulties for the police enforcement today, how to deal with all these threats, because they have to have in mind, will this lead to a court making a decision? And then again, it's the balance, if a rapper says kill the police, does that mean you should go and kill a particular police? But if someone says, well, you bloody artist, you should be killed, how do we define that? That's very, very tricky. I don't think there is an easy answer to this, but even freedom of expression, people who are defending freedom of expression needs to discuss this, because there are what I would call freedom of expression fundamentalists. And that's also a problem, because, you know, does anything go?
Yeah, I mean, this is the sort of big question, of course, that especially within this part of the world and the US American model of, you know, regulated speech, which has sort of course, had this big turnaround where the ACLU, which had a very different stance on First Amendment a few decades ago, has very recently, in light of the rise of white supremacist groups, said that this unfettered speech model brings with it its own problems, you know, and this is the old maxim in political science that, you know, you can't tolerate people who want your annihilation, then it becomes a problem of free speech. And I think we have the same issue with hate speech. I mean, and this is something I'm struggling with it in a different way. I grew up in Germany, so I'm very much, it was socialized into a system where it's not okay that you can say, you know, you can't just say anything. As you say, Ole, Holocaust denial is criminalized. And I've seen how important of a pillar of freedom, of defending freedom of expression, of those who are people who are minoritized, who suffer from under the pressures of power asymmetries, how this, you know, these kind of clauses can at least be empowering. I'm not sure that they are indeed effective in practice, but to be legitimated by the law is, of course, important. We have one more question before I want to do a closing round, but I'm sorry, I'm really bad at looking at the screen at you guys at the same time as reading questions. Apparently this is not my thing. Yeah, of course, here's a question that is, you know, it's that there's of course a difference between discussing examples where there's at least a semblance or some remains of democracy versus what is going on in Turkey, which is described here as under the conditions of fascism. How can art sort of be part of struggles for greater justice? Here's the example, of course, of Group Yorum, which has a very which sort of is a group of musicians who have lived through all kinds of incarnations of different types of art censorship in Turkey throughout their, since they've been established.
There was one thing that I tend to forget that. I mean, maybe it's not censorship, but it's when platforms disappear. What is that? You know, do you remember MySpace? You know, a lot of musicians was in MySpace and suddenly disappeared. Is it censorship? No. I mean, any commercial platform can do whatever they want, but to be dependent on internet platforms, whether it's YouTube, TikTok, or whatever, is also very risky. So when it comes to publishing houses, publishing companies, of course, established companies have also made censorship and whatnot. But you know, it's a very complex world for the artists to live in today. And with that, although we're not going to talk about remuneration, is also, you know, is it a platform that I can promote my whatever I do? And on the other side, people expect this to be free, but there's nothing free in this world. I mean, the platforms make a lot of money.
I wanted to say, sorry, one more thing about, just to acknowledge the question around, which also points us back to the fast and on the one hand steady, but on the other hand, sort of again exponentially fast deterioration of the conditions in Turkey. Also in terms of seeking legal remedy, or in terms of being able to reclaim the kind of artistic freedom that is, after all, enshrined even in the present constitution, even enshrined in the 1982 constitution, with all the buts that unfortunately are also in international agreements, as Ole reminded us at the beginning of our coming together. I can't really answer that question, but what I do think is, and that's why I opened the panel with saying that even in these dark times, it's sometimes important to go back to the fundamentals, not because these remedies necessarily work at this moment in Turkey, as some of them did even in a mere 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. Some of these legal remedies did actually work. But I also think that the kind of work that Sarah and Ole have been doing is also the kind of work that can prepare, that has to be done no matter, or that we all wish could be done no matter what the conditions, to be also prepared for different political moments. Because I think all too often what we've seen in Turkey, but not only there, is that it's really important to be ready for struggles when opportunities arise. There are great practices also that from Turkey of doing these kind of engagements on working on alternative lawmaking practices, on all the reform groups that have worked on trying to reform freedom of expression laws, to write draft constitutions. It's not so long ago that there was great hope for a new constitution in Turkey, or at least some hope enough that civil society actors came together in groups and wrote, parts of this constitution. So when the moment would be there, I would be remiss also not to point out to the Memory Center, Hafıza Merkezi, who's working and documenting human rights abuses. And when they started, it was always like, when the time for transitional justice comes, it doesn't matter, it's to be prepared. And to sort of not just archive these for history, but to prepare for, within a continued struggle, to prepare for that next moment where these works really can come to a different fruition and to a different life.
But I think it's also important that, we've all been through COVID depression for a year now, and we shouldn't end up in censorship depression. I like the title that Shanar suggested in 2006, which was "Music Will Not Be Silenced." And we have a saying in music circles that you can kill the singer, but you cannot kill the song. And I think that's the truth about the thing. But even the most repressive systems cannot stop artistic expressions. But artists can be persecuted and violated, and audiences can be violated. But you cannot fully stop these things, especially not in the world of today. Songs move ahead, films move ahead, images move very, very fast. And so we will survive.
I haven't forgotten about you, Shanar. But I want to say something before we give you the last word. It's already 11, so I had one more question for everyone, but we're also, losing people. So I would say, Shanar, could you go ahead and sort of briefly make your announcement or your call for support before we close up?
I also took a lot of notes to answer about. I give all of them up. I give up all of them. And now, probably we can make not a happy, but hopeful end. Maria Ressa, she's a journalist from Philippines, probably will have a long-term imprisonment just because of her journalistic work. IFEX, inform all members and ask them to say a few words to be brought together as an international message. We had a different idea in an artistic form. It is a very short and very simple piece of song, not a masterpiece of art, of course. The target is that it can be repeated for all whom we want to support today and in the future. A very simple pattern, just like happy birthday to you. We made it and sang for Maria. If you have 25 seconds to hear it and allow me to share my screen, you may see and hear it. Can you allow me to share
Go ahead.
Desk? Just a minute. Let me share my desktop.
Is this your announcement you wanted to make?
We all love you. We're all beside you. Maria, Maria, you're not alone. We all love you. We're all beside you. Maria, Maria, you're not alone. We all love you. We're all beside you. Maria, Maria, you're not alone. We all love you. We're all beside you. Maria, Maria, you're not alone. Is everybody seeing it?
We were able to see it, but we heard it very little. Is it online, Shanarbi?
Sure. And we have repeated the Turkish version of this in many participants from beaten journalist Levent Gültekin, imprisoned MP Ömer Faruk Gergerlioğlu, getting ready to repeat for journalists Ahmet Altan, politician Selahattin Demirtaş, businessman Osman Kavala, and others. We will be happy to have it shared by all, for all who suffer and have echoed all around the world. I can send it to all of you if you wish, since you said you could not hear so well.
That would be great. That would be great. Thank you
This is
so
a
much.
musical contribution.
Thank you so much, and also so much needed that sometimes when we can't necessarily feel very restricted in our own contexts, there's still the possibility of reaching out in solidarity to others who are experiencing similar repression and restrictions. I think maybe next time when we meet, we should talk about how we envision what we envision artistic freedom to be, or where we think freedom really lies within these discussions. Sumru, do you want to say a last word, perhaps for those who have stayed with us, just to say how we follow your programs? And thank you ever so much to Ola and Sarah and you for inviting us and having us.
Yes, I also want to thank you very much, Banu, Ola, Sarah. In such a short time, you managed to discuss artistic freedom of expression in many different frameworks, and I'm sure that it was really enjoyable for our audience too, and who made great contributions. Thank you again. And I also want to thank Speak Up and PT24 team, and also great work of our translators. Thanks a lot, everybody. So it was a great night.
Thank
so
you.
Hope to see you in other events.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very good.
Bye.
Bye-bye.